Good afternoon, everybody. Martin has pressed the button and cut you all off in your prime. But never mind, we're going to move on to some other prime events for this afternoon. Welcome to everybody, whichever continent that you're on at the moment. We're very glad to see you all. The very first thing I'm going to say is to remind you about the next TSF online meeting, which is not as it normally goes in the sequence. It's on the 17th of October. So make a note of that if you'd like to come, and I'll possibly, oh dear, that's our front door. Oh, Martin will go in a second. We'll remind you about that a little later, I'm sure. So we're going to move on to our first speaker, and actually all three speakers this afternoon. It's going to be such an interesting time. I'm looking forward to all the papers. We first of all have Hiebert Kerst, and she was for a very long while associated with the American Folklife Centre at the Library of Congress. Martin and I were very fortunate to have a superb visit there with you know who. It won't come to me at the moment, but we yes, just had a lovely visit. And Catherine is going to be talking to us about somebody who went around with Maud Carpelli's in about 1950 and did some absolutely wonderful work. So Cathy, can we come across to you?
Okay, I've unmuted, and should I share my screen now?
Yes, please.
I think you're ready to go whenever you'd like to start. We'll allow you to do a bit of clicking and looking at the screen to get yourself ready.
Okay. Oops. I guess. Oh, sorry.
This is looking good.
So you can hear me?
We can.
Okay, very good. I'm going to be speaking about what I call Return to the Appalachians. Maud Carpelli's and Sidney Robertson Cowell retraced the steps of Cecil Sharp in 1950. As a bit of background, I'd just like to mention that at the American Folklife Center, where I worked for almost 25 years, I became very well acquainted with recordings made by Sidney Robertson Cowell, especially her work for several large New Deal collecting projects she conducted during the 30s. Cowell's field recordings and commentary about them are absolutely impressive. Colorful, personal, insightful, and highly descriptive regarding what she collected, the performers she recorded, and how she viewed her work. I know much less about Maud Carpelli's and will be especially interested in your comments on what I have to say. In the fall of 1950, Carpelli's and Cowell spent 3.5 weeks traveling together in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee in search of ballads and tunes recorded earlier in the century. For Carpelli's, it was a return visit to retrace the steps she had taken with Cecil Sharp in the 19-teens to find singers of English ballads and songs. As most of you are aware, at the time, Sharp and Carpelli's traveled predominantly by foot in all manner of weather, listening to hundreds of ballads and songs sung by nearly 300 singers, and transcribing their melodies and lyrics by hand. Maud Carpelli's was in her early 30s at the time. In 1936, Sidney was hired by Charles Seeger in the New Deal's Resettlement Administration to find and record traditional song. She quickly became adept at recording on a Garwick instantaneous recording machine, traveling independently throughout the South and the Midwest, alone in her car, often with a dog. Her travels into Appalachia took her to Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Sidney then was in her mid-30s. This experience of collecting traditional song in the Appalachians was thus shared by the two women. Here's a picture of Maud on the right and Sydney on the left, standing by Sydney's car. All of the pictures that I'm going to be showing you were shot on Sydney's camera, some by her and some by others. In 1950, Cowell and Carpelli's borrowed an I-Core tape recorder from the Archive of Folk Song at the Library of Congress for their Appalachian recording trip. The archive was then headed up by folklorist Duncan Emmerich, who was eagerly encouraging coordinated efforts to expand the library's collections of traditional music. For the recording trip, Sydney supplied her own car, which she drove. From the 6th of September to October 4th in 1950, the 47-year-old Cowell accompanied Carpelli's, some 20 years her senior, seeking performers who had sung songs for Sharp and herself many years before. In one of Cowell's letters written at the time to her husband, Henry Cowell, she described Maud in the following way, and she always refers to Maud as MK in her writing. So she writes, under her pointed rain hood, tiny MK with her beak of a nose and her twisted smile and glowing black eyes looked so much like some elfin creature from under a mushroom. A large red one would make a becoming house for her. Remarkably, in the towns and settlements they visited, the two women turned up 31 performers or their close relatives from the early part of the century who Sharp and Carpelli's had heard sing decades before. For this presentation, I am drawing on the approximately 4.5 hours of recordings they made in 1950. I'm also relying on the logs that Maud and Sydney made of the songs recorded. Maud's diary of the trip, as well as Sydney's field notes, photographs, and correspondence. On one of the first days of their trip in 1950, Sydney wrote, "We left Washington on September 6 around 2 p.m. for the Skyline Drive down the Blue Ridge Mountains. MK in a state of incredulous excitement at finding herself in the Appalachians again after 30 years, 32 years to be exact. MK, of course, remembers 30 years ago and is equally unable to imagine the prevalence of electricity and good roads such as exist nowadays in the mountains. One of the first singers they found to record was Mrs. Florence Puckett in Afton, Virginia. Mrs. Puckett was the former Florence Fitzgerald who sang a number of songs for Sharp and Carpelli's in 1918, including one that was printed in English folk songs of the Southern Appalachians in 1932. At the time, Florence Fitzgerald Puckett was 23 years old. Here, at 55, on September 11, 1950, she is singing the same song, Shooting of His Deer, in Afton. Some of the sound is not...
Went hunting all about in the dark. He shot Molly Thunder, and he missed not her heart. He ran right up to her when he found she were dead, and over her bosom a many a tear he shed. Up stepped Jimmy's father, whose locks were turning gray. Says Jimmy, dear Jimmy, do not run away. Stay with your own country till your trial comes on. You'll never be punished for shooting Molly Vaughn.
In her field notes, Sydney writes that Mrs. Puckett's two daughters wanted to record the popular tune Nobody's Darling with the guitar, but, quote, we declined because Maud says that, quote, that song is in books and on records. It is the old songs that would otherwise be lost that we are after, and the old ways of singing. Sydney said that because of this, they steered clear of songs that were, quote, jukebox sentimental or religious. In Nellysford, Virginia, also on one of their early days on the road, they found Doll Small sitting in his house, much like he had been decades before. In her field notes, Sydney wrote, "Mr. Small is a beautiful, strong old man, still busy with his chores at 81. His voice is still fine and his singing smooth at its best, though he gets breathless and tires easily." Sydney went on to say that he smiled at the sound of his voice on the recording, but was incurious about the machine. "I made the mistake at the beginning of the recording and had to ask him to start again twice. He was confused, but so anxious to be helpful and avoid making me feel embarrassed. Nothing childish about him for a moment. A strong man, a person able to look at the world and the people in it with a smiling tenderness, so moving to see. The house was full of womenfolk and children, all curious to see and hear." Nearly 30 years before, in May of 1918, Cecil Sharp's diary, written in Nellysford, reads as follows. "After supper, we went with Doll Small, a most delightful family, Doll and his wife and 12 children, all smiling. They sang to us and then adjourned to the next house where there was a new and quite good piano upon which I operated to the delight of the family, who smiled more than ever. They really are a delightful and happy lot, and it was a pleasure to be able to return them something." Doll was then in his upper 40s. In 1950, Sydney described, "He sang in a rocking chair, rocking to and fro gently, his straw hat covering his stomach and his hands folded over it. We did not ask him to stop rocking. That was so obviously part of his performance and so unconscious that to call attention to it would have made his singing less natural." Here is a recording, and I apologize, the recordings are not as loud as I would like, but this is what I can do. He's singing Young Hunting or Lady Margaret, recorded on September 10, 1950, introduced by Maud, who says that he has just sung Little Boy Hugh, listed in the song list as Sir Hugh. This was also sung to Karpeles and Sharp in May of 1918 and published in Sharp's collected volume, folk song volume.
This is Mr. Doll Small at Nellysford, Virginia. He's just sung Little Boy Hugh, and he will now sing Lady Margaret.
Last Friday night, little Margaret lay asleeping very sad. She heard the sound of a bugle horn that made her heart full glad. She heard the sound of a bugle horn that made her heart full glad.
In her field notes, Sydney gives some insight into the process by which she and Maud sought and interacted with performers from earlier in the century. Here's an entry from Sydney's notes on September 19, 1950. "We did a lot of inquiring for Virginia Bennett, but to no avail. This means each time a long conversation, MK explaining that she was here 30 years ago, first of all, then that the subject of an inquiry is a friend she has so often thought of since. Then there follows usually a great deal of family history about who is whose brother, aunt, cousin, wife, uncle. The brother one lady's aunt was, everybody insisted, not her uncle, but her cousin. Well, maybe he was her cousin too." Sydney also writes quite a bit in her field notes about what Maud was looking to record, often with a touch of disdain or at least disapproval. For example, she writes, "Lots of people reputed still to sing the old songs, turn out to be singers now of hymns, which MK will have nothing to do with." She also describes how the singers and their families responded to Maud. MK fascinates all these people. They are hypnotized by her speech, and she is talkative as all get out with them, but plain and simple, mostly about the weather, about that old gentleman, Mr. Sharp, and all the songs and travel 30 years ago, about family histories and names, sisters and cousins and aunts, such as people in the South love to trace at length. Sometimes they tire and turn to me with a kind of relief, but they like her enormously and are anxious to do what she asks. Several days into the trip, Sydney complains in a letter to her husband, Henry, that she is so very behind in writing notes on the singers as, quote, I get terribly exhausted with the 10-hour days of hunting people out, up and down the mountains, and reassuring MK, who gets more and more melancholy and has terrible dreams of watching the folk song collectors she knows carried out to sea and drowned. It is hard to find her people. Most of them are dead, half at least. The rest have not sung for 30 years, enduring the raising up of 13 young'uns, or have got religious and so won't sing love songs, or else have shattered minds. Another singer they found from earlier in the century was Emma Hensley Shelton, also known as Mrs. Donald Shelton in 1950. Emma was 13 years old in 1916 when Sharp and Carpelli's visited, the daughter of Reuben and Rosie Hensley, some of whose song texts are included in Sharp's English folk songs from the Southern Appalachians. Here is Emma Hensley Shelton at 47 years of age in 1950, singing a song that her mother sang in August 1916 for Carpelli's and Sharp.
Oh, don't you remember on yon green mountain where you and I first fell in love, where the little birds were sweetly singing, and even to the little doves. Come all ye fair and tender ladies, be careful how you court young men. They're like a star on a summer's morning. They'll first appear and then they're gone.
Sydney noted that Maud was especially pleased to hear Emma sing and felt that she had truly inherited her parents' love of the old songs. However, recalling the recording session of Mr. Lloyd Fitzgerald, age 55 in 1950, who was a child when Sharp heard several songs sung by his father, Sydney writes, MK wanted the songs recalled exactly as sung before and kept on prompting and rehearsing him, and he got confused. She does not always do this, but occasionally succumbs to temptation in this respect, as she does not think the recordings more important than Sharp's notation, and seems often to feel that later changes can only be corruptions. She will agree with a more modern point of view in discussion, but very often reverts when it comes to action. The recordings are in her mind living examples of what Sharp set down, useful for the BBC and her lectures chiefly. 58-year-old Victoria Morris, here she is, was a singer that neither Maud nor Sydney had heard sing before they traveled together, but had been recommended to them by Arthur Kyle Davis, an English professor at the University of Virginia, who had recorded her in 1932. Sydney was completely taken with Morris's performance, enjoying the quavering, stylistic ornamentation in her singing. She wrote that of the singers they recorded, Morris was the best and the strangest and the fullest of graces. Although Victoria Morris's voice was new to Maud, the singer lived in Montfair, Virginia, a place that Maud remembered fondly from her travels with Sharp. In Sydney's field notes, she writes about the session with Victoria Morris. We were early and MK was in a terrific tizzy lest Mrs. Morris failed to appear. She wanted to go after her, to go after the sun, to go to a phone, anything rather than sit still and wait. However, Mrs. Morris turned up exactly on time in a very neatly made plaid dress, yellow, red, and green, looking very handsome with her black eyes and hair. She looks rather Italian, a big woman with like an earthen column, restrained and dignified, but very friendly. She is quite an extraordinary person, her singing stunning in style, full of breaks and quavers. Maud wrote the following rather spare notes in her diary log. Mrs. Morris learned most of her songs from her mother, who lived in Greene County, Virginia. When I told Mrs. Morris that I should be taking the songs to England, she said, "It is right that you should take them back where they belong." Maud did not comment otherwise that I know of about Mrs. Morris singing. Sydney was, however, completely entranced. She wrote, "We listened to exhaustion for 3 to 4 hours. Simply wonderful songs and singing style. I really never had such an afternoon because such singers have always been rare in my experience, and one never hears so many at once at such a high level of beauty and taste." Here is Victoria Morris singing the first few stanzas of Young Beichen.
There was a man who lived in India, and he was one of the high degree. He never would be contented until the voyage he taken to sea. He sailed east and he sailed west. He sailed over Turkish shore, and there was taken and put in prison, where freedom never expect anymore.
They also met and recorded the fine ballad singer Horton Barker from Chillouee, Virginia, though Maud was reluctant to do so. Maud wrote the following in her recording log. Mr. Barker is blind. He reads Braille and is an intelligent and well-educated man. At the time, Horton Barker was 56 years old. Here is Horton Barker singing The Farmer's Cursed Wife.
There was an old man at the foot of the hill. If he ain't moved away, he's living there still. Sing hi-diddle-i, fi-diddle-i-diddle-i-day. He hitched up his horse and he went out to plow, but how to get around he didn't know how. Sing hi-diddle-i, fi-diddle-i-diddle-i-day. The devil came to his house one day, says, "One of your family I'm going to take away." Sing hi-diddle-i, fi-diddle-i-diddle-i-day.
Sydney's field notes included the following comments about Barker. He was so sweet, so interested in England, and he said he felt he knew the country fully from reading Dickens in point of Braille. He is almost literary in his speech. I'm so glad Maud finally decided to hear Barker, though she was not interested, because he'd been recorded before, because the suggestion had come from me, and she didn't want to. But I kept saying this was the sweet singing she had heard before and was now missing, and she should hear it. Once there, she was, of course, captivated entirely. And elsewhere, Sydney remarks, she does all of this with good manners and graciousness, usually, but she has the "I will do it myself" disease 10 times worse than I ever have. Here's a picture of Horton Barker and his wife on their front porch in Chillouee, Virginia.
Cathy, I'll just remind you that we're getting very near to time.
Okay.
So just to give you that little warning.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
The dynamic between the two women is fascinating and truly points to a difference both of temperament, but also of diametrically opposed views of life and the evolution of folk song. In her published revisions of the biography of Cecil Sharp, Maud gave brief descriptions of her 1950 field trip with Sydney, indicating that the Appalachian region is no longer the folk song collector's paradise that it once was. Among other things, she lamented the fact that the radio and religion have become the arch enemies of folk song. She speaks about the sudden changes in the structure of American life, even in the remote areas, that had led to, quote, the putting aside of the traditional arts that were associated with the old ways. Civilization, as she puts it, in terms of roads and electricity, public education, and the radio, seemed to have destroyed what Maud longed to hear. For Sydney, this sentiment was a complete anathema to her entire understanding of what the performance of traditional music entailed. For her, folk music made by individuals and groups represented an ever-changing, dynamic recreation of tradition in the present, not to be viewed as an ancient relic or like a beetle preserved in amber. It characterized a living, breathing, evolving, expressive artistic form with current meaning for its performers. This was much at odds with Carpelli's vision of what traditional song represented as she had experienced it. Judging from the field recording that I have done myself, I think that doing field work as a team might be very trying, even if you have a common understanding of what you're about. But for these two vastly different women collectors, whose concepts of tradition and living song and their dissimilarities of personality and affect, they were bound to undergo some conflict one with the other. Still, it is an absorbing story. There is much more to tell about the Appalachian collecting venture, and it would certainly be instructive to pair the comments and reactions of the two collectors side by side, but there is no time to engage in that right now. I'm eager to hear your thoughts about what I've described, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Cathy. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everybody feels the same. A really terrific presentation and such a window into the lives of the two women. And then, of course, all those wonderful singers. I could sit all afternoon, I'm sure, and listen to that beautiful singing. I'm afraid we don't really have time for any. Oh, is Martin saying one? Maybe if somebody has a Marge, we're going to have to make it very, very quick question from Marge, if you don't mind, please, which if you'd like to unmute.
I know, and there's so much I want to ask you about the dynamics between the two women because I'm fascinated. What was the reticence for Maud to record Horton Barker? Was it because he was literate, or what? What was the?
I think he was a well-educated man, and she really was looking for people who were not as well-educated and seemed to carry the old songs in a way and perform them in a way that that she thought, you know, they should be singing.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I really would love to hear more. Maybe at AFS or something, we could have coffee or virtual coffee and talk more.
That would be wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'll add my thanks to the many thanks that are appearing on the chat as well. And I'm sure if somebody wants to ask another question, you'd be happy to look at those and reply. So,
and I'd love to receive emails or questions because excellent. I'm very curious.
Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful, delightful.
Thank you.
So if you'd like to, get organised, and we're going to move to our next speaker, who is Julie Mainstone Savas, who, having been in the Appalachians, we're now going to focus over into Nova Scotia, and another presentation that I'm really looking forward to. I've spent some lovely time looking at Julie's website, which I can highly recommend. There's some superb things on that, but I'm sure she's going to tell us a lot more about what she's been doing, an in-depth study of a particular family collection. So Julie, are you with us? We don't see you yet.
There we go.
Oh, excellent.
Jimbo, I don't see my.
That's right. Take your time. It'll happen.
I don't see my PowerPoint because it's just right click. Here. There we go. Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's fine.
Are you seeing that?
We are, yes.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. Wonderful to be with you all, and I'm just very happy to share my project with you. I call it my little labor of love, the Carrie Grover Project. I'm Julie Mainstone Savas. I've had the absolute privilege of uncovering this body of music that had traveled 4, in some cases 5 generations down to Carrie through this family of immigrants from Britain and Ireland. They began arriving in the early 1700s to the shores of Nova Scotia, and I was able to trace the family back 5 generations with some great help from a historian. Eventually, Grover put all of her songs into print. There was one published songbook, A Heritage of Songs, and then there was an unpublished one, which I will show you later in the presentation. I first stumbled upon the published collection in 1999, and that began my journey down a rabbit hole, chasing down Carrie Grover and her music. I'm going to take you through my journey today with some history of where this collection originated from and the people, the very people who held these songs near and dear to their hearts. If you'd like to hear more, there are podcasts on my website, www.carriegroverproject.com, that tells the narrative chronologically with songs interwoven. Carrie sings on the podcast, and I also have contemporary singers singing as well. Lisa No singing on my most recent one. So I will navigate you through this website as well. All right, so let's get started. This is Carrie. This is a photo from the American Folklife Center, Library of Congress. It was taken in the late 40s on the steps of her home in Gorham, Maine. The Folklife Center has been very generous with me. Carrie was recorded by 3 song collectors in the 1940s. Eloise Hubbard Linscott, Sidney Robertson Cowell, and Allan Lomax. The LOC provided me with all the recordings, and they said, she's the star of our collection and no one knows who she is. And I was shocked by that statement, but they were very happy to hear that someone was finally doing something with her music. So in 2012, I took a 1-year leave from my teaching job to devote myself to the project. I'd been awarded a grant from the Nova Scotia Folklore Society, and my mission was to literally follow in the footsteps of this family, to go to the sites where they lived, in the villages and towns where they lived, and to find out if there were still traces of music within the family. More than a decade had passed since I first found the songbook. And during that time, I'd met many members of the family, two of Carrie's grandchildren, Callie and Roy. Roy has since passed away. Callie's still doing fine. We talked many times about republishing the collection, but full-time jobs and raising kids, it didn't happen for about a decade when I picked up the project again in 2012. So this is what captivated me. It all began with this, A Heritage of Songs. This is a page out of the book. There are 140 songs in A Heritage of Songs. It's divided into 2 sections, mother songs and father songs. But what is special about this, as you can see, it's a story beneath, right here. There's short snippets that tell the reader who sang the song, where it was sung, and when, or how they acquired a particular song. It appeared to me to be like a family scrapbook, memory book that was interlaced with story. That's what initially hooked me. I was at the time performing. I was a folk singer, and I was always looking for new material, which is how I stumbled upon this book to begin with. But I have to say, it was the stories throughout A Heritage of Songs that just captivated me. I don't believe Carrie ever intended for this songbook to be a major publication. It was a memory book that was devoted to her descendants, her children and grandchildren, to explain and illustrate to them the importance of this music to their ancestors. She was moved to preserve these songs when she overheard one day, she overheard her father say to her mother, this is probably about 1914, just before her father died, he said, Eliza, when we die, all of our songs die with us because no one is singing them anymore. And it was true. Carrie's children weren't singing them. The radio had taken over and people weren't singing the old songs. So it was at this point, maybe a few years later, when she began in earnest getting the songs she knew from memory down into notated scores. Just to give you an overview, oh, here's another one. The story at the top there about her brothers going to lumber camps. I just felt like I really came to know this family through all of her stories. I preserved all the stories on the website as well. To give you an overview, this is a map of Nova Scotia. Her family came through here. They were in the Annapolis Valley first, and then down through Windsor, and then Carrie lived here. She was born in 1879. So, this is the home that her father, George Spinney, built on the shores of Sunken Lake. The house is no longer standing, and these people are the people who moved in after Carrie and her family moved to Maine. The house is no longer standing. Carrie was the youngest of 9 children, raised in a home where someone was always singing, she said, and during a time when song singing was their only form of entertainment. Also, she wrote, it was a breach of good manners not to ask someone to sing a song. If you had a guest in your home, it was bad manners to not invite them to sing a song before they left. Carrie lived here until she was 12 years old, 1892, when her family moved to Maine. I had a beautiful tour through Sunken Lake when I visited. These are the rocks where Carrie played and where her mother did their laundry, their weekly washing. Carrie did not leave this settlement, did not wander beyond it until she was 12 years old, when she visited a port town to the north. That entire time, all she heard was traditional music, mostly the songs of her family. So it was a very insulated environment for her. This is Cousin Bessie lived here and was very helpful to Carrie when she began putting the songbook together. Carrie was in her 60s when she started putting the songbook together. Carrie could easily remember the melody to any tune she ever heard, but she had trouble remembering the words. Bessie had a trunk full of songs in her attic, the words, not the scores. The two of them in a letter wrote that they were spending a fortune mailing letters and lyrics back and forth from Nova Scotia to Maine. This home was set for demolition when I visited in 2013. And on that day, my husband and I were welcomed to a big luncheon at the home of a member of the Long family, which was Carrie's maternal side, maternal grandparents. I had gone in search of traces of the old songs that might still be humming through the family, but sadly I found none. I was given some beautiful old photos, a booklet full of Carrie's memories that Carrie's daughter Ethel had compiled, and it was from these stories that I was able to tell such a complete story on the podcasts. They're beautiful, detailed memories of what life was like in a rural farming community in the 1800s, you know, full of family pranks and music and what they had for dinner and what her father caught in his traps in the woods. It's beautiful. Okay, this is Carrie's father. This is George Spinney. He used to proudly say that he was born in the same year as Queen Victoria. Times were very hard for them. George had to have several streams of income to keep his family afloat. He owned a sawmill, maintained a farm, made wooden barrels and axe handles that he sold in town, and transported potatoes and wood products via ships to the mainland. Many songs came from the Spinney side of the family in both a heritage of songs and in the unpublished manuscript. It's through the Spinney family that we get most of the songs. including George's older sister, Mary. Just her contributions were beautiful. Arthur McBride came from her, Gypsy Davy came from her, many others. George himself sang political songs, Irish political songs, which we think he probably learned from his father-in-law. Songs from his days at sea, aboard ships, ballads, and songs he heard sung by slaves on the wharves and plantations of Virginia in the 1850s. Also the songs that he learned in the lumber camps in Maine and Massachusetts. In addition, were all the songs that were passed down to him from his parents. This is Eliza Long, Carrie's mother. She sang songs that were passed down from her mother and grandmother. She sang while knitting before the fire in the evenings with her husband. There's a lot of great stories about Eliza that I've included in the podcast. The stories Carrie recalled really painted a portrait of these people and the role that music played in their lives. Carrie held vivid memories of sitting on the floor while her mother spun wool, with the wind whistling through the cracks of the house and her mother singing what she said, old melancholy songs like Sheffield Apprentice and Crappie Boy and Prentice Boy. Those are some of her favorites, and those come from her grandmother and probably great-grandmother. Here is one more family member that we can't miss. He was so important. This is Anson Long. He was Eliza's firstborn child. He was born out of wedlock and raised in Eliza's parents' home until he was 5 years old, and when Eliza married George, Carrie's parents married. When I went to that luncheon in Sunken Lake, another member of another family came, and he said, "We claim Anson. Anson's a Schofield." So I do know who his biological father was, although George raised him as his own. Anson is a critical link in the lineage of the music because Anson, like Carrie, recalled many, many songs that his maternal grandparents sang. Those grandparents had passed away by the time Carrie was born. There's a 20-year age difference between Anson and Carrie, by the way. And so those grandparents had passed away, and it was through Anson that Carrie learned many of the songs from her maternal grandparents. And without this man, many of those songs would have been lost. Anson was renowned for his repertoire. He would sing in pubs and singing competitions and often outsang his competitors. He loved to fiddle. That was his first love. He made his first fiddle. I don't think it's the one that we're seeing there because he made his first fiddle when he was about 9 years old. Much later in life, Anson and Carrie lived near each other in Maine and continued to fiddle and sing together. So the family left Sunken Lake in late summer 1892, never to return. George had gone on ahead to help build a house with his son, Jim. This is Jim's home. It's difficult to make it out, but this is the Spinney family, resettled in this home in a small village just outside Bethel, Maine. Bethel is in the northwest corner of the state of Maine. I located the site of this house. There are large imprints in the land where it once stood, but otherwise there's not a trace of the home. This is the school Carrie attended, just about half a mile down the road from this house. This is no longer standing. There's a new schoolhouse that was built in 1896. 4 years after Carrie arrived. So she finished elementary school in this building. And then this is Gould Academy. This was the only high school in the area. Carrie attended this high school, though she didn't graduate. And I show this because she returned here to seek out the music teacher, Anne Griggs. Carrie returned here to have all of her songs notated in 1954, 1955. And Anne Griggs writes the introduction to A Heritage of Songs. This is Ina Grover. When I visited Bethel, Maine, I met with members of the family, and then this was April of 2013, and they encouraged me to drive just outside Bethel to an area where the Spinney family had lived in the late 1800s. And so I saw this cute little cemetery, so we pulled over and ran in, and I thought I would try to look for headstones of the Spinney family. Just on a whim, really, just on a whim, we pulled over. And there's Ina in the cemetery. She was, I think, 92. And she asked me if I was there for the funeral for her sister the following day, who was 96, who passed away. And I said, no, I'm looking for the Spinney family. And she said, oh yeah, they're down there a little ways. She knew that right off the bat. So I ran down there. I found George and Eliza and Carrie's sisters and Carrie's sister's family. And so then I realized that this woman knows Carrie. I can't believe it. And so I run back to my car. I get a picture of Carrie. And I said, just to be clear, are we talking about the same person? And I held up the picture of Carrie with her fiddle in a beautiful long dress. And not only did she recognize Carrie, but Ina said she was at the party where that picture had been taken. It was Carrie's 50th wedding anniversary. And she remembered that Carrie played the fiddle and her sister Bertha danced a jig along with her fiddle playing. I returned 2 years later in 2015. I returned to Maine a couple times. I returned and interviewed Ina, and we had a lovely time. She's since passed away, but she was a wonderful supporter. This is Callie. This is Carrie's granddaughter. Callie's mother, Ethel, is the person responsible for compiling all of Carrie's family stories. Callie is now the keeper of the Spinney family memorabilia. I sat with Callie several evenings in a row going through a large box full of papers. You can see them all strewn all over the table. We were very busy. Large box full of papers, letters, photographs, and diaries. We found Carrie's daughter's diary. In fact, there were 4. This one in particular was written in 1915, and it's wonderful to see Carrie through her daughter's eyes, but a warning to all of us to be very concerned about what our children write about us in their diaries when they're upset. This is Carrie playing her fiddle. I think she's about in her 30s. She had her first child when she was 17, and she had 3 children. And sadly, both of her daughters passed before she did. She outlived her daughters. Here she is standing. These photos are also from Callie. Here she is standing beside a rose bush. And there's an interesting story of the rose bush, which you can hear on the podcast. This rose bush was passed down through the family. The root of it was passed down. Everyone had a piece of this rose bush in Nova Scotia. Everyone had it outside. Different members of the family had a rose bush. And this one also, she's standing beside, came from Carrie's grandmother, George's mother. And we could not find that rose bush. We went looking. So, got ahead of myself here. Well, as I said, I began with 140 songs from A Heritage of Songs. That's all I had to begin with, and really all I expected to have. I also had hours of recordings from the Library of Congress. In 2015, I made a call to a folk club in Maine where I knew Carrie had sung in the early 1940s. At that time, she performed at folk festivals in Boston and Philadelphia, and she was known to have a large collection of songs. The folk club told me that everything that they'd had from her had been put into storage and that they would let me know if they ever found anything. 6 months later, I came home from work, and on my front doorstep is a large envelope, and inside is a very frayed and tattered, nearly complete, unpublished manuscript of more of Carrie's songs. There was no title. I've entitled it The Main Manuscript. Clearly, Carrie was planning to publish another songbook, but this was 1958 and she was in poor health. It contains approximately 70 more songs, though several had already appeared in A Heritage of Songs. But with all the recordings and the 2 songbooks, I was now up to over 240 songs. At this point, I think I have all of them. Every now and then I get a surprise. 240 songs, plus I have 33 fiddle tunes from the Eloise Hubbard Linscott collection. All of these songs are on the website and also on the Roud Index. Many thanks to Steve Roud for that. My goal has been exactly the same as Carrie's: preservation. She did all that she could during her lifetime to preserve her songs, and I'm really just picking up where she left off and ensuring its passage into a digital world. This is a photo from the main manuscript. The notation was done by her friend and fiddle teacher, Fred Hill. It's written on heavy cardstock, and it's Scotch taped, 60 years old. I have it right now. It's being sent to the American Folklife Center shortly. But notice the story, again, all throughout. No one interfered with our singing unless Mother had a headache. Only we were not allowed to sing anything but hymn tunes on Sunday, and we were never allowed to sing before breakfast. Sing before you eat, cry before you sleep was an old saying. There were many old sayings that came down through this family. Her parents were, there's so many wonderful stories. You have to listen to the podcast. I could really go on for a couple hours here. It's been challenging for me to try to keep this within 20 minutes. So here's another example. Again, you can see the Scotch tape, the handwritten notation. This is the rum and the brandy. It's just a relic. Okay, so I'd like to take you now to the website. So I'm going to navigate over to there. This is my website. It's carriegroverproject.com. This is stories about Carrie, all about her, a couple pictures you've seen. This is about the project, was, my journey and discovery. Here are the podcasts. I currently have 5 podcasts. I'm going to do one more to sort of complete the series. I say one, but they're so much fun, I may end up doing 2 more. And then here you'll find under songs, A Heritage of Songs, and the main manuscript. Just yesterday, we completed the fiddle tunes. So now there are fiddle tunes on the site. So let's just navigate to the song so you can hear some of the music. Heritage of Songs, a little blurb about it. Again, father songs and mother songs. I preserved as best I could everything out of the songbook. I'm going to go first to Gypsy Davy, one of Aunt Mary's songs, one of my personal favorites. Here we go.
The squire came home late at night, inquiring for his lady. The servant made him this reply: she is gone with the Gypsy Davy. Toddling-tom, toddle-lie, toddling-tom, tido. The servant made him this reply: she is gone with the Gypsy Davy.
And we'll go to another one, give you a few samples here. This is Jolly Soldier. I included Jolly Soldier because you can hear her speaking on the recordings with Allan Lomax only. They speak back and forth. He asks her questions, she tells stories, she explains things. It's wonderful. And so here's what I get to listen to.
I learned this of my father when I was a very small child. All these songs he learned when he was a young man. The Jolly Soldier. Is all the jolly soldier that lately came from war. He loved a young damsel, a damsel so fair. Her fortune was so great it could scarcely be told, and she loved the jolly soldier because he was so bold.
And maybe we have time for one more. I'll do one. I love this one. This is Captain Kidd, which Carrie's grandmother learned when she was a little girl.
Oh, my name was Robert Kidd as I sailed, as I sailed. Oh, my name was Robert Kidd as I sailed. My name was Robert Kidd, and God's laws I did forbid. And most wickedly I did as I sailed, as I sailed. And most wickedly I did as I sailed. Oh, my parents taught me well as I sailed, as I sailed. Oh, my parents taught me well as I sailed. Oh, my parents taught me well to shun the gates of hell. But against them I rebelled as I sailed, as I sailed. But against them I rebelled as I sailed.
Okay, and that concludes my presentation. And I hope you'll take some time and listen to the podcast, which tell this story of this family and their music over down through the generations, beginning in the late 1700s. Thank you very much.
Julie, thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful again. Gosh, please do go to the website and listen to some of that music. There's some real treasures there, and certainly in your talk you've opened up so many fascinating things. I know people are going to be running off and finding songs and tunes and finding out more about them. We have time for one question for somebody who's absolutely bursting to ask Julie something. I'll hold on a second. If not, because it was just so wonderful, so much that well, was delightful to listen to and to hear about. So we will then take this opportunity to move on. Thank you again, and we will look forward to some more news about your projects. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
And so we will now move on to our third speaker. What a terrific afternoon it's been. Absolutely excellent. And our third speaker is having been to Nova Scotia, USA. We're going to go up to Cumbria. So Sue is a singer, a researcher, a writer, and she's going to tell us more about the sort of double life of the man she's been doing lots of work on over the years. So Sue, if you could take over for now, please.
Indeed, thank you very much. Went to the wrong slide. That should be the beginning. Yes, I've done a lot of research on this chap known as the Cumberland Bard, Robert Anderson, who came from Carlisle. Last year, in fact, marked the 200th anniversary of his birth. Why did I put his death? It was his birth. He was born in 1770, so that must 200. Oh my God, it's the 250th anniversary of his birth. I don't do numbers. Which ironically was also the same anniversary as Wordsworth's, though the two never met. And Wordsworth was at the other end of the county, but Wordsworth was a subscriber to an edition of Anderson's. And why I looked at him was for his dialect poetry and the number of these that went into the song repertoires of many Cumbrian singers. My own research into Cumbrian folk song, the details are up there. 500 songs, of which 24% were in dialect, and 37 of those by Robert Anderson, and some were sung well into the 20th century. And for those of us friends across the Atlantic who don't know, Cumbria is the top left-hand corner of England, the northwest, next to the Scottish border. Oh, my slide isn't moving on. Why could that be?
Try clicking on the slide with your mouse and then see what happens.
Oh, thank you, Martin. He knows all the tricks. Just a little tiny bit of context here, that regional dialect really came to the fore in Cumberland and Westmoreland, which together make the modern county of Cumbria, with a few other bits attached. It was quite an early movement for dialect poetry compared to Lancashire, where apart from Tim Bobbin, most of the rest of the Lancashire dialect poets and the songs that came out of that were industrial, were urban, and were well into the 19th century, whereas the Cumbrian renaissance of poetry and dialect was much earlier and started in the middle of the 18th century. Robert Anderson, as I say, born 1770, English Downside is a very working class part of the city of Carlisle, which was a textile town of Cumbria, and it's the county town of Cumbria, and it is a small city, and it's very close to the Scottish border. His love of song was born from hearing Scottish ballads sung by a neighbour when he was a very small child, who he said came from the Highlands. He received a little bit of education at a couple of schools until age 10, but largely was an autodidact, was interested in literature and was interested in music as well, but was sent to work in the local textile industry and apprenticed as a pattern drawer, making the blocks, designing the blocks to print calico, the patterns on calico. And as part of that, he went to London, returning to Carlisle later, where he published his first poetry collection, which was not in dialect, but standard English. His first collection in dialect was in 1805. So that's a brief bit about his early life. But importantly, in London, he went to the Vauxhall Gardens. The Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens were the source of a lot of what we now call folk song repertoire. And here we see, I think that is Mr. Dignam singing in front of the Vauxhall Gardens resident band with people wandering below. It was very informal performance and a lot of music going on, both instrumental and song. And James Hook, a very popular composer of the time, was composer in residence, and he set a number of Anderson ballads, the first of which was Lucy Gray of Allendale, which you see in a later publication there with the music. And that particular ballad was said to be the inspiration for Wordsworth's Lucy poems. The reason Anderson set about writing the ballads was he heard what were being called Scotch songs at the time, which were songs either with Scottish dialect. They were pastoral, they were northern, and sometimes Scottish in theme. And he thought they were rubbish, a lot of them, and he thought he could do better. And he went home one night and penned Lucy Gray of Allendale. And a lot of these songs then went into print, into cheap print, into street literature, as broadsides, as chapbooks, and as songsters. The only songs he produced for Vauxhall, though, were in standard English or with just that teeny bit of dialect to make them sound Scotch songs, as they were popularly called, as they said. So you'd have the odd bonny and lad and lass and this sort of thing. And those are some of the ones here. But he went back to Carlisle after 4 years. He hadn't completed his apprenticeship, but his father was ill, he says, so he came back. And he wrote a dialect poem, which ended up being printed on a broadside, and that was Betty Brown. And he was encouraged by his friends who loved the dialect poems So he produced quite a little body of them after 1801. The first dialect poem should have said 1801, not 1901. I don't do numbers, as I say. And his most fruitful period for dialect writing was then. He was encouraged by his friend, in particular the poet Thomas Sanderson, to collect them together and to publish them. And they were published by Heatherton of Wigton, no, Mitchell of Carlisle to start with, and then Heatherton of Wigton. And he also indulged in lots of musical activities back in the city. His father had bought him a flute when he was just a child, and we find him very much involved in musical activities. I shall read some extracts from his diaries which explain that. I've put his lodgings there because I met a nice cross-reference to Anderson. He actually lodged with this actress, Charlotte Johnson, who was in a travelling theatre company, who wrote her memoir. So we hear about, we often read Anderson's autobiography in works of his, but here we got somebody else's memoir mentioning him, which was nice. The downturn in the textile industry prompted him to move to Belfast, paying homage en route to Robert Burns's grave. He was a great fan of Robert Burns, and his dialect poems were written, he felt, in the style of Burns, and usually specified an air to be sung to. He came back to Carlisle when industry took a downturn again in Belfast, and poetry, poverty and drinking, as I said there, characterised his final years. Friends attempted to produce a very posh-looking 2-volume subscription edition of his poetry in English and in dialect, which was subscribed to actually by Wordsworth and Southey. But it didn't gain much popularity. It didn't make him the money he needed, and all the other editions of his Cumberland ballads, for which he'd sold the copyright many years earlier, he made no money at all. I want to get on to his songs because that's what we're here to. So a songwriter, as I said, he loved the ballads, he played the flute. His songs always had an air in the manner of Burns, but he also wrote his own airs and his diary entries. This is where I want to read you a couple, show his musical activities in Carlisle. I'm on my sheaf of paper here. The extracts just relate to the period 1800 to 1803. But they reveal his mingling with publishers and printers locally, literati, drinkers and musicians and a band, but also drink features quite heavily. Spent the evening at Jolly's printing office, he says. Jolly was a printer of chapbooks and a local newspaper, and drank a hearty glass with Mr. J. This is 1800. 5th of November, drank tea with Kerst and a small party with whom I spent the evening till 9. Drank a hearty amount at Jolly's expense on account of his almanac. 21st of December, at home all day as usual. Copied some pieces for Hook and read a few hours. Christmas Day, arose without 1 coin in my pocket, and doubt this will be the poorest week I've known. 1801, we find entries like he wrote the stanza of a song at the request of his friend Thompson of Newcastle, but not liking it, I used it to light my pipe. In the 31st of December that year, we find him having a walk in the morning, spending the afternoon in idleness, and in the evening he supped with the band. This was the local volunteer band. This was the time of the Napoleonic Wars, when there were local militias formed all over the country, and Anderson joined his own local militia as a flute player in the band. And he supped with the band and a few friends and played in the new year. There's lots of other mentions of him meeting the band and receiving copies of music, receiving Dibdin's songs from Soulby, the printer in Penrith, attending parade with the band, composing his march. And he goes a lot to the Harmonic Society, or Philharmonic, he sometimes calls it. It was a group of amateur musicians and singers who performed to each other in usually some licensed premises or other. And the only other thing I'd mention about his music there was, it was a singer from Wigton, where I live, with whom he liaised when assigning tunes to songs, because this chap was an excellent singer and he took his advice. His songs then took on a life of their own after his death in 1933. And in the 1870s, we find William Metcalfe, who ran the local Carlisle Choral Society, getting hold of them and arranging them for concert performance, though with semi-professional singers and piano. And some of them, those members were James Walter Brown, and John Crothers, whose singing was later collected by some of the Edwardian folk song collectors. Sidney Nicholson was the organist at Carlisle Cathedral at the time, and he collected songs from Brown and submitted them to the Folk Song Journal. John Graham published his Dialect Songs of the North in 1910 and included a couple of Anderson songs. And Geoffrey Mark not only published some arrangements of songs, but also notes in an article about hearing an old man singing one of the songs, Sally Gray, in a local inn. And you can see the other performances that, so certain songs of Anderson's continued with a life of their own well into the 20th century. The Edwardian folk song collectors, as I mentioned, we had Lucy Broadwood published Sally Gray in her English county songs, and Gilchrist collected the same song from Mrs. Carlyle in Barbon in 1909. Mary Wakefield, it was her tune collected from an old man locally that Lucy Broadwood used in her book. It's not the usual tune. And Frank Kidson noted a version sung at the Westmoreland Festival. And Ralph Vaughan Williams went to Carlisle for just one morning and noted down 7 songs from John Carruthers, who we've already mentioned, and they were all Anderson songs. Some of those were published in Folk Song Journal in 1907. Of all the songs, it's Sally Gray that was the most popular and one of the most enduring, along perhaps with Canny Old Cumberland and the Bleckle Murray Neat. Sweet Sally Gray, with its popular tune, which is not the one Anderson specified, nor the one that Mary Wakefield used, has certainly had a life, not just into the 1970s, but has been recorded recently. Here's a recording by an unknown singer at...
Give order, fellas, give order now. Out's gonna sing. What kind of sing is out? Sally Gray? Go lad out, go lad out. Go on. Kom down plant till speakerent, lumen fat we look in the breeze. I wasn't for Dawson Parish, it would come to the of the rest. I lost the bit of the wager, and got in the tuppence alley. Them cannon against we as love away, and another keep of Sally Gray. I was 7.
Sorry, I'll cut him off in his prime. That was an unknown singer in Ambleside, and that was a BBC recording. We think at a hunt meet, but not sure. And that's the Mary Wakefield tune that Lucy Broadwood published. But here we've got the better known tune sung by semi-professional singer called Joe Wallace. You'll hear how it's a more formal arrangement, albeit with guitar. And this was a recording he made in 1970. Sorry, I'm having problems with the cursor. There we go.
Come, dearie, I'll tell thee a secret that don't look to in the breeze. For a while for all Dawson parish, it come till the ears of the priest. Now I'll hold thee a bit of a wager, a groat to the twopence a year. Thou never guess we as in liquid, and no but keep off Sally Gray.
Moving on, there have been other recordings. That top one is Joe Wallace's recording. I've mentioned the BBC archive recording and Joe Wallace, but in the 1970s, when there was a lot of interest from local folk singers in finding Cumbrian material, my friend Angie Marchant recorded some Sally Gray and others. And Paul and Linda Adams, who I'm sure some of you know, Fellside Recordings, did record, this is a very nice Canny Cumberland.
Your Buckland was gentry that sing many a county, me right bridge Palaver and Pragas the will. Mountains, lakes, vales, rocks, wood, waters, rich meadows, but canny old Cumberland, them all still. When Nestle and Dallas is through this white county, no lofty grand towers to catch the weak eye, but money old vessels go for to brave fathers when Cumberland yards county define. We've called it for.
I'll cut it off slightly because I want to get in the final recording, and just to show the strength of these songs and how they can bear all sorts of interpretation. I'll give you the beginning of Striding Edge Band's Borrowdale Johnny, which is another Robert Anderson song. If I can. There we go.
Got no money in my pocket, take the rough road, find my way. Got no money in my pocket, I will come home rich someday. Got lots of money in my pocket, take ashes growing, sitting by the lakeside. Got lots of money in my pocket, hot ashes glowing, sitting by the lakeside. Got lots of money in my pocket, take ashes growing, sitting by the lakeside. Got lots of money in my pocket, hot ashes glowing, sitting by the lakeside.
And it gets even funkier as it goes on. So to wrap up, here we go. Yeah, Anderson's legacy, as I see it. For one thing, as I mentioned in a presentation I did recently for TSF, the reportage of long narrative poems of the dialect writers gives us real insights into the music making in rural festivities, and Anderson's poems in particular, the Clodbeck Wedding, the Wharton Wedding, and the Bleckell Murray Merry Night, offers great insights into local social history. Also, another legacy, I think, is that the anniversary celebrations organised to mark the centenary of his death, and that's right this time, at 1933, brought together those people interested in dialect who went on to found the Lakeland Dialect Society in 1939, and that society's still running. Another legacy is a song called Jenny's Complaint, which is actually what Bert Lloyd based his Recruited Collier lyrics on. I think that's quite well known now. And the dialect songs are an important part of our Cumbrian folk tradition, but I'm left with a couple of questions. There's a picture of the book again, which tells you where you can get it. It's not only my book, I actually reprint in this book a facsimile of Anderson's 1828 edition of his Cumberland Ballads, which is the first time they've been in print for over 100 years. So two questions I sort of ask myself and haven't answered yet. Why was it that Anderson's Vauxhall songs in standard English didn't gain wider circulation amongst traditional singers, but his songs in dialect did, at least in Cumberland, though not elsewhere? And are Anderson's songs too place-focused and regional, both in their subject matter and particularly in their language, to attain a wider circulation? Yet Burns's did attain a wider circulation. So a couple of interesting questions there, which might prompt perhaps some of you to ask some more questions. Please do.
Thank you, Sue. That's absolutely superb. A lovely examination of that rich heritage that you've got up there. That's well, another amazing paper. So thank you so much. And while you're thinking of some questions, I was just wondering, are people still singing Anderson songs in folk clubs and the like that you know of?
Yes, a friend of mine who comes from over that neck of the woods is happy to sing Sally Gray and give him half a chance anytime.
Yeah, thank you, George. That answers that.
Gregson, I don't know whether he's given, but Keith Gregson does perform some of them.
I sing one which Keith set to music called Madam Jane. So I sing that in folk clubs now and again.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Sue? Yes, we do. John Baxter, would you like to unmute?
You said that you felt that his English language, if you like, poem songs didn't get passed forwards. Sally Gray seems to have been sung in the sort of concert hall. There was more than one arrangement, I think. I put something in the text.
That's one of his dialect songs. That's not his...
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. I was misunderstanding. Shot down in flames. Thank you. Not to worry.
Thank you. Hilary Warner Evans, if you'd like to put your question.
I'm curious because you said that the I'm wondering if his songs, were they sung, you said the dialect songs were sung well into the 20th century, but were they sung in the decades immediately following his death also, or was it more that there was like a revival of interest in the late 19th century? Because you were mentioning that there was some activity starting in the 1870s, but I'm not clear if there was anything prior to that.
Well, I only have a few newspaper magazine reports of them being a couple of songs. Canny Old Cumberland became a sort of anthem for Cumberland and was certainly sung in the 1820s in London. That's before he died, I think, or maybe 1830ish. There was an organization called the Cumberland Benevolent Society, which helped out expatriate Cumbrians in working and living in London, and Cumbrian peers and people who'd made money would meet and have balls and dinners and make money to help provide for destitute expatriate Cumbrians in the capital. And at some of their dinners, it is recorded that they did sing, certainly Canny Cumberland, and possibly Sally Gray, but I'm not sure about any others.
Thank you. Lisa, if you would like to put your question, Lisa, now.
I'm speaking with certain fascination but ignorance of all the varieties and subtleties of dialect in England and in Scotland. You talked very specifically about his writing in Scots dialect, basically, a sort of a formalized poetic dialect under the influence of some of the dialect Scots poets. I'm wondering whether there was a Cumbrian dialect that was distinct from the Scots dialect, and whether he was writing in a dialect that was indeed fashionable from a literary point of view, but not one that local working people would have used. And has that material that he wrote in this sort of literary Scots dialect been incorporated into local dialect life?
I think when I said he wrote in Scots, that was when he was in London writing for the Vauxhall Gardens. He was simply giving a little flavour of Scots by using words like lads and lass and bonny, to make it appear as if it was Scots without actually using Scots dialect. Right. Carlisle dialect in Cumberland is not too far away from the dialect in southern Scotland, but has a lot of vocabulary that isn't the same. Anderson was definitely writing in his local North Cumbrian dialect, but there are different variants of Cumberland dialect according to which part of the county you went to. But he certainly wrote to be understandable for local work. He was a local working man. But many of his books include a glossary so that they can be read wider amongst the middle classes, and they hoped to sell more through the local aristocracy and the book buying public. He was trying to write for a market, but he was a working man and he used the dialect, and he didn't write in a very, very strong dialect either. There are scholars who think that both he and Burns wrote, Burns wrote in effect a stage Scots, and dialect was Anderson was also using. He wanted to be understood by as many people as possible because he wanted to sell his work. And to that extent, I refer to it elsewhere as performing dialect.
Thank you. Right. And our final question for this afternoon, Conrad, would you like to put your question? You need to that's it.
I'm here.
Yep.
I think.
Go ahead. Yep.
Vauxhall Gardens is a fascinating place. It changes from one sort of thing to another, changes channel itself over its existence. Different kinds of shows, different kinds of settings, different kinds of programs. They had many stages. People wandered around from place to place, sort of like a fair. Lots of money was spent, and that brought the songwriters, part of their food chain. And Thomas Hudson was there. He was a brilliant singer. He did not write the Guy Fawkes song, but he claimed it as his party piece. But it's amazing how it all goes together. Everything always sort of ends up going into the 7 dials and into many different pamphlets.
Absolutely.
It's quite a nexus of activity on many different dimensions. And the important thing is to know when you're talking about Vauxhall as to what configuration it was in at the time. But it's something that really deserves a lot of care and more research. I'm looking for a complete account of it, but there must be one out there somewhere.
I agree. I would like to do more research into it, but I haven't time because of my other research interests. I would just like to say that Anderson never got paid for his Vauxhall productions, but he did get free entry to the garden, so he could come and go at will as payment for his songwriting.
Thank you. Right. Well, we've come to the end of an absolutely fascinating afternoon. I'm so grateful to our three presenters. So Catherine Hiebert Kerst and Julie Mainstone Savas, and lastly, our friend Sue Allan. Absolutely wonderful, and I know from the comments that we're seeing it was enjoyed by so many people. And I know it takes a lot of work to put one of these presentations together, having sat and looked at Martin doing all his work. So thank you for doing all that and sharing your work with us. So a little reminder that the next TSF meeting will be on the 17th of October. So in the meantime, keep well, keep busy, keep enjoying yourselves, keep singing, and we look forward to seeing many of you there. I'm just going to ask Martin if I've forgotten anything.
Don't think so.
No? Right. So that looks as if we're about to sign out. So goodbye, everybody. It's been delightful to share this afternoon with you. Bye now.